Hello everyone. Today we are learning about the Metamorphosis by Frank Kafka. This is a novella. It was written in German in 1915 and was published in 1917. Now, when it was published, a term was coined, and that term is surrealism. So let's write that down. In 1917, let's zoom in a bit. Okay, 1917, surrealism as a term is coined. It's also when Metamorphosis is published. The change. The reason I want to read this book tonight is because I think that all of us undergo change, consequential change, and currently as a society, we are undergoing consequential change. So in reading this book, we can feel what change, enormous change, the kind of change for which you cross a boundary really feels like, and what metaphorically it looks like. Surrealism is coined, and in 1924, Breton writes his Surrealist Manifesto. This is also the year that Kafka dies of tuberculosis or consumption. So we have the collision of these two events. Now, surrealism, he wrote, was defined as so. And let's flip through to the definition of surrealism before we begin. I like to begin with genre because we read books through the lens of their genre. And genre is so much a theory of life and how life works. And I think that theories of life embodied in literature is what genre really is. Okay, let's keep looking for this page, going through all the notes. There are so many notes. Keep going. Surrealism. Here is the definition. A cultural and artistic movement wished the unconscious mind to express itself, resulting in the depiction of illogical scenes or ideas. This is based on the idea that dreams and reality contradict themselves. They're paradoxical. And paradox and surrealism is an attempt to merge them into a super reality or a surreality. And so surrealism, you can see, is like a breakdown of the term super and reality. It is bridging the gap between the illogical and the logical. If we understand both, we come to a super reality, something so real it is beyond it. And so the Metamorphosis, I think, is a surrealist text in that it contains many elements of surprise, non sequiturs, and the close placement of the absurd with the logical right beside one another. And so in the first page, we're going to see that. So let's go, before we go to the first page, to Breton's Surrealist Manifesto, 1924, and what he wrote here. He calls it, in the manifesto, pure psychic automatism, by which one proposes to express, either verbally or in writing, the real functioning of thought, dictation of thought in the absence of all control exercised by reason, outside all aesthetic and moral preoccupation. Now let's break down this definition to fully understand it. Okay? Automatism, to me, sounds like automatic and autonomous. So it's suggesting that we might reach a more perfect, a more natural type of thought if we release our minds from control. And the control that dominates our minds is that dictated by reason and morality. And I find it interesting that moral preoccupation is juxtaposed, that it's a preoccupation that is moral, because preoccupation implies to me a kind of busyness, a kind of obsession, if that makes sense. And so that we are busily obsessed with morality. And when you're preoccupied, someone might say to you, "Why, could you go do this thing for me?" And you say, "No, I'm preoccupied." So in that case, it suggests a sort of paralysis caused by this moral preoccupation there, which is an odd thing to think about, that morality might stop the flow of ideas to some extent. And I think there are certain types of morality that perhaps do that, but it would be dangerous to consider that for all methods of morality or types. But control exercised by reason, how much of life do we simply excise out because it does not fit the narrative with which our brain is comfortable? I'm going to write that down. I kind of think of Alice in Wonderland. How much... Sorry if it's blurry, there we go. Does our brain expel because it does not fit a narrative? We remember in logical sequence, I suppose. Information is logged carefully away, though I do wonder where our thoughts go when we forget them. If they are put away because we forget things because they have no use in the narrative, I do wonder about that. But that's a big question. How much does our brain expel because it does not fit a narrative? And that narrative is perhaps defined by the logic we are taught, the reason we are taught in school, the morals we are taught, right? The aesthetic desires that we have, right? We are perhaps not getting at reality because we are clouding it with all of these other things. Do you think so? And I want to think about how perhaps Kafka deals with this. I call his book surrealist because I think it's thinking about these questions. First of all, it involves, as surrealism does, the juxtaposition of illogic with logic, the non sequitur, as in moments flow into other moments without much reason to it. And it attempts to achieve a kind of super reality. Certainly it does all of those things. It also emerged on the same time that surrealism was coined. So there's great reason to think that it does. But of thinking that words are controlled by a kind of logic that might not be 100% true. Certainly it's a truth and a reality we've accepted and agreed upon. But is there a reality that exists outside it that we cannot see because we have no words for it? That's another question. So I'll turn to the Kafka's book here. There's a nice little bed where the cockroach or the man wakes up as the beetle. It's technically not a cockroach, but a beetle. I'm going to go to an essay that's written about Kafka's Metamorphosis by Stanley Korngold. And you see all the words very close. We'll start here at the bottom, right? He's going to introduce us or speak about the opening of the text. So perhaps before I do so, I might read the first line of the book. so you know what it is if you haven't read the book. The first line goes as so. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. You see that the book begins not with falling asleep, as Alice in Wonderland does, or Wizard of Oz does, but it begins with waking up into the nightmare, rather than falling asleep and entering it. So it is almost as if the unsettling dreams he speaks of was not his dreams at night, but the life he lived before he became an insect, a monstrous vermin. The first half of this sentence is the logic. He wakes up one morning from unsettling dreams. But the second part of the sentence is the illogic, so you see the surrealist juxtaposition. He found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. Right? That is the illogic. Logic here, illogic there. When we read the illogic, we realize the truth of this line, that this line was misleading us because we believed and applied our own mind's logic to the sentence when the logic of the text is oh so different. You read the first line only before the comma and you are tricked. The second line tells us that no, the unsettling dream was Gregor Samsa's life as a traveling salesman. And it is the monstrous vermin now that is the life. We begin with the word monstrous vermin, but I think that sometimes Kafka is more ironic than we say, as in he says the opposite of what he means. And so this line again falls in upon itself. I don't believe that Gregor Samsa is, in fact, a monstrous vermin, nor do I think that Kafka believes that he is. But it is the life before and the people who belong to that life, his parents, his mother, his father, his sister, and his manager, who look at him and believe him to be it. But does he believe it of himself? Only if he accepts the vision that all of those around him have for him. And it seems to some extent he has, because he has transformed, or they have transformed him into this. That brings us to another genre before we come here, and that is the genre of naturalism, which is my favorite genre in the whole world. It's always been my favorite. So let's flip to naturalism now. I have so many notes in here. My exercises. I make exercises for myself. And we keep going. And we keep going. Keep going. And going. Here we are. I think we've come to naturalism. All right. Let's see, where do I have it? So naturalism is a form of literature that is based on observation and scientific objectivism, and it focuses on a main character, a protagonist, that has no control over their own fate. So it's a deterministic type of writing. But the determinism is not godlike, as in the fate is not determined by God, but rather determined by the social and environmental world surrounding them. Social constructs and environment. As in the world in which you live, the world created by humans, by people, makes it inevitable that you become a certain thing. And no matter what you do to fight against it, you will always fare. So we are at the behest of our environments. The universe, or God, or whatever, is completely indifferent from human life, and human life controls everyone's fate. Okay. So, in these books, characters will confront social conditions that cannot be reconciled by free will alone, falling on tragic circumstances due to social class, inner strife, and conflicting emotions, morals, or passions. So we see here, of course, the word conflict. And naturalism will also often focus on realism, as in the realistic depiction of everyday events, along with romanticism, with a focus on emotion and symbolism. And it also has an interest in nature, individual expression. And so the social world is defined by emotion. Our society is defined by emotion. Emotion leads us to act. So it makes sense that in this deterministic form of literature, it is emotion and the emotion of people that will perhaps define or decide your fate. It is also your emotions that will cause the response to the world in which you live, a response that might end in your unraveling. Okay, so naturalism in this case would suggest that Kafka turns into the cockroach not out of his own free will, but because the world perceives him as one. And they perceive him as one with such clarity that he becomes one. Essentially, the book says that the perception of others is so powerful that it can move you, it can change you, it can steal your life. And so one must be very careful of these perceptions. So we'll go now to what I was speaking of, which is a combination of that naturalism and that surrealism in Stanley Korngold's essay. And he's speaking here of the opening line of Metamorphosis. The opening recounts the transformation of a man into a monstrous, venomous bug. In the process, it appears to accomplish still another change. It metamorphoses a common figure of speech. So what is changing is not only character, but also language. The second transformation emerges in the light of the hypothesis proposed in 1947 by Gunther Anders. Kafka's sole point of departure is ordinary language, and according to this, the departure occurs in the first line. More precisely, he draws from the resources on hand the figurative nature of language. He takes metaphors at their word. For example, because Gregor Samsa wants to live as an artist, one who lives on air, lofty and free-floating. In the eyes of the highly respectable, hard-working world, he is a nasty bug. And so in the Metamorphosis, he wakes up as a beetle whose ideal of happiness is to be sticking to the ceiling. A lot is said here, and so we'll start first with he takes metaphors at their word. What does this mean? Let me take a drink of coffee. Even though it is nighttime. All right. So, this means that he sees the falsity in language itself, that our language is built on metaphor. It's built on saying things that aren't true and believing them. And so he says, fine, I will do what the language says. That metaphor, I will depict it as if it is really true. So the lies that we tell, oh, that man is a terrible insect, he will say, yes, perhaps he is, and he writes a story of it. She is an animal, yes, perhaps she is. And so if you wanted a writing prompt for your own writing, I would say, find a metaphor you are fond of, whether it be from a work of poetry or a book, or a conceit from a modernist writer. conceit is a very absurd metaphor. You find one of those and write a story as if the metaphor is literal. And he does this exactly with the first sentence, right? Because he takes our sense of the world, which is that a dream, an unsettling dream at its most, is normal. And he turns the dream into life and the life into the dream. He reverses it, and he is doing what best he can with what he has. Words are in some ways terrible failures at communication. And they are much like the surrealist state, right? That they're bound up in logic, words are. They're bound up in reason. They're bound up in morality. And to break free of the confines of words is difficult. And so he attempts to do so by trusting the metaphor, believing the metaphor, believe the lie, show us the lie, and we will see in it the truth. Now he says here as well, he wakes up as a beetle whose ideal of happiness is to be sticking to the ceiling. Now this is fascinating because there's a Kurt Vonnegut video I might have seen where he talks about plot. And he talks about Kafka being a book that goes like this, right? There's happiness, it starts low, and it just goes to infinite sadness. And I think it does if you're thinking about it in a logical way, right? But I think there's an intriguing thing. As Sam says, human happiness goes down, the inverse occurs with his insect happiness. His insect happiness actually goes up. It goes up and it goes down, the human condition. And so a thesis that we might have before we start the book, we can write it down. Because it's always good to have predictions before you read things, little hypotheses. A hypothesis might be, let me write in the lines, in the margins I shall write, is that, how do I say, as Samsa's human unhappiness, the book begins in Samsa's human unhappiness, but finds itself, I think, begins lost in Samsa's human unhappiness, but finds itself, in his insect joy, depicted in the great game, always fascinating. Of discovering oneself. Anew. All right, so I will say of this, that, and this reveals to us a peculiar paradox in people, and I think maybe you all feel this, I certainly do, which is that people, for the most part, they feel they have a love of habit, a desperate need for it. But at the same time, a great resentment for the boredom that habit provides. So we rely and we turn every so often to chaos. When things are working, you get bored. This is the paradox of humans. And we wish them to work We want nothing more than for them to work. But the moment they do, we want only for them to be broken. And so this is a paradox. Now, paradoxes are, if you think about Schrodinger's cat, nothing can be alive and dead at the same time, can they? So paradoxes are at their name, at their core, illogical, right? And yet, as people, we are living in this state of illogic. Does the insect live in a state of illogic? I don't know. We'll see if Kafka's Gregor Samsa, the beetle, does. Certainly Gregor the human does, and so we'll look at what he thinks. So let's read the first page, and then we'll get to a little bit of the second and think about that illogic. Again, looking at this, we are thinking about how Gregor Samsa wants to be an artist, and yet he is trapped in the body of a traveling salesman. He knows precisely what he needs to do to be happy, but does not know how to do it and resolutely refuses to. That's another paradox that exists in this text, and that exists for all of us, is that we know precisely what we must do and yet have no idea how to implement it. We can imagine so perfectly a future if we take so-and-so action, but we don't know how to take the action, and that's the issue. It also comes, I think, this particular paradox, again, this illogical state in which people live, I think it also comes from something that we'll read here in an Auden essay. Auden, of course, is a brilliant poet, and he wrote about Kafka in this essay called The Eye Without a Self, and he includes this epigraph, which I had a lot of trouble reading, and I didn't look it up or anything. I just kind of went with my own way. Sometimes it's all you can do. I think that Auden would be pleased with this to an extent, because here he says, given that Kafka's Metamorphosis to him is a parable or a short story with a clear moral, the parable it's very hard to critique, because everyone's reading will be vastly different, because parables act as mirrors. So this is what he says of critiquing these books, and that's what makes me feel better about the poor reading of this quote that I'll do. But he says, the meaning of a parable, in fact, is different for every reader. In consequence, there is nothing a critic can do to explain it to others. Thanks to his superior knowledge of artistic and social history, of language, of human nature, even a good critic can make others see things in a novel or play which, but for him, they would never have seen for themselves. But if he tries to interpret a parable, he will only reveal himself. What he writes will be a description of what the parable has done to him, of what it may do to the others. He does not and cannot have any idea. And so this is the fascinating thing, I think, about this particular text, is we all see in it a completely different thing. And when you teach it, the issue becomes that you're forcing your perspective onto someone else, much like Gregor Samsa's family forces their perspective of him onto him. Their desires become his desires when we see little glimpses of what he truly wants. And it isn't until he is an insect, when he's essentially freed from their desires because they are revolted by him. It is his revulsion, their revulsion of him, that frees him, their hatred of him that frees him. It isn't until then that we really see what it is to be happy, what joy looks like. The joys of this life are not its own, but our dread of ascending to a higher life, The torments of this life are not its own, but are self-torment because of that dread. Now here it says that our unhappiness does not come from outside of us, but within, particularly human unhappiness. That now in society, it is our world, it's our society that causes us misery, and it is not the natural world at all, as it might have once been. It is not sickness. It is not death necessarily, but it is the misery of everyday life. And for some reason, that misery of everyday life is caught up in this concept of ascension. And this is where I struggle to understand what he means by ascension to higher life. And I think this is where it becomes a reflection. Because for everyone, it's ambiguous enough. For everyone, higher life can mean a different thing. Removed from a context, that is also true. So in this case, I would say that the joys of this life are not its own, but our dread of ascending to a higher life. He encapsulates here, for me, the feeling that there is a better future there is a better future if only you could capture and manipulate the present properly. If only you could do what you know you need to do, then that future would be brighter. And of course, the issue with this is that we see the future at all. I don't think the bug has any perception, or the bug he becomes, has any perception of what the future is. We are constantly thinking about the future. What will I do? What will I do? What will I be? What will I say? How will it go? Right? Such a powerful little word, will. And it is that future itself and the ascending to it, the arrival to it, that causes us such dread in our current moment, even if we believe that the future will be brighter. Because we feel that that great, bright future is created in the toils of today. We feel, I must toil, toil, toil. I must make the right choices to make this future real. Of course, this future will never be real, no matter what great choices you make. That would be the naturalistic perspective, right? That the future will be what it wishes to be, outside of your own influence. That's the deterministic. The free will concept actually would give us a bit of anxiety because it would say every moment that you make is building a future. And so I find for myself that when I imagine a future that is good, it does not bring me joy necessarily, but brings me a great deal of shame. It gives me a great deal of dread, because I feel that today, in this moment, as I am toiling away at a job that I not particularly like, that I am doing nothing to make that future a reality. And in that lies that paradox. I know what I need to do to make that future real. And what is that future? It's embarrassing to say, but I would just like to have a partner, and I would like to be in my house that I had as a child, that is by the sea, that will be sold soon, and I will never see it again. It will actually be demolished. And I wish to be in that house that will soon be demolished when I am old. And I want very little in that house. I do not want things or cars or anything like that. But I just want that house and a person in it that I love, and books and writing. And that's all I wish for. And yet I feel now that the entire world and every act that I make and I take is not helping me get there. I feel that I'm wasting my time. And that's exactly what Kafka's Gregor Samsa feels. He feels he knows very much his future, and yet he is wasting his time. Though I'm not sure that he actually does know his future as well as he says he does. And so let's look. There are glimmers of what he knows, glimmers of a happy present that shine through ever so briefly. So let's start from the beginning and think about those questions. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. He was lying on his back as hard as armor plate, and when he lifted his head a little, he saw his vaulted brown belly. Sorry, I didn't realize it wasn't in the frame. Okay. Sectioned by arch-shaped ribs, to whose dome the cover, about to slide off completely, could barely cling. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, were waving helplessly before his eyes. "What's happened to me?" he thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human room, and this is where we see a bit of that irony that Kafka offers us, which is he's speaking about everything as if it is a scientific observation. This ridiculous, illogical world, as if it is the most real thing, most scientifically real thing in the world. Very careful, detailed, but also emotionally withdrawn discussions. Only little on the small side lay quiet between four familiar walls. Over the table, on which an unpacked line of fabric samples was all spread out, Samsa was a traveling salesman, hung the picture which she had recently cut out of a glossy magazine and lodged in a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady done up in a fur hat and a fur boa, sitting upright and raising up against the viewer, a heavy fur muff in which her whole forearm had disappeared. So right away, the first thing we are introduced to, the first thing that characterizes Gregor Samsa, is the pretty frame on the wall that holds not a girlfriend, not a lover, but a model, the ideal of a woman who is not real, in a gilt frame. This seems at its core, when we read it on this first page, is highly pessimistic, in that he is performing that it kind of goes with our belief here, that life before was a dream and now is real. Because even the woman that he was with was a dream. She is not real. But Kafka is smarter than that. And when we read this page, it is a later page that will throw that reading into contention. So if we go now to 11, is it 11? I don't remember. We see his mother's opinion of him when she's speaking to the manager. And she says this: the manager comes and he's worried, and the family is worried because they can't get Gregor out of his room because Gregor is a giant beetle, but nobody knows that yet. And so she's trying to explain to the boss why he hasn't come out yet. And she's trying to characterize Gregor for the boss. Whether we believe her characterizations or not is another thing entirely. She is certainly manipulative. She appears at first to love her son, but by the end we realize she does not. That again, he becomes a burden when he can no longer earn money for the family. Believe me, sir, there's something the matter with him. Otherwise, how would Gregor have missed a train? That boy has nothing on his mind but the business. It's almost begun to rile me that he never goes out nights. He's been back in the city for 8 days now, but every night he's been home. He sits there with us at the table, quietly reading the paper or studying train schedules. It's already a distraction for him when he's busy working with his fret saw. For instance, in the span of 2 or 3 evenings, he carved a little frame. You'll be amazed how pretty it is. It's hanging inside his room. You see it right away when Gregor opens the door. And so here we see that the little frame on the wall is actually a sign of his artistry and of his love for art and his love for life. It is a sign of his attempt to make something real, not the fabric samples he sells, but something real, something of his own. He is an artist. And so while we might read this ultimately as pessimistic, we soon learn from the mouth of the mother that this thing was actually deeply important to him. Why is it that we learn that from the mother, however, and not Gregor Samsa? Why can he not see himself clearly and see his happiness clearly? It is because he is blinded by a future he imagines will come, a future that depends upon his sacrificing of the present. And so if we go now to that future which he has sacrificed for the sake of his present, we'll see it. All right? I'm going to read his monologue here. Oh God, he thought, what a grueling job I've picked. Now the irony here, or the absurdism here, is that he's gone from thinking about his cockroach body and feeling it to immediately thinking about his job. So essentially he wakes up as a cockroach and he goes, oh my, what a strange body. And then he goes, but a terrible job I have. So it's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It's a non sequitur that surrealism loves. Oh God, he thought, what a grueling job I've picked, day in, day out, on the road. The upset of doing business is much worse than the actual business in the home office. And besides, I've got the torture of traveling, worrying about changing trains, eating miserable food at all hours, constantly seeing new faces, no relationships that last or get more intimate. To the devil with it all. This getting up so early makes anyone a complete idiot. Human beings have to have their sleep. Other traveling salesmen live like harem women. For instance, when I go back to the hotel before lunch to write up the business I've done, these gentlemen are just having breakfast. I've written in the corner that this is depicting envy, because envy is an affect of inaction. When you're envious, you paralyze yourself. Jealousy is different. That's very pointed and focused on a single person. But when you are envious, it feels like it lacks a subject. You're envious of so many things that you could not possibly act on it. There's a determinism to envy, and things that are deterministic, they make you paralyzed. It feels inevitable. When something feels inevitable, you cannot act to stop it, and that's what makes it so, so dangerous. And the routines of human society feel so, so inevitable, and that's why we struggle so hard to break them. Now here he says, for instance, blah, blah, blah. That's all I'd have to try with my boss. I'd be fired on the spot. Anyway, who knows if that wouldn't be a very good thing for me. So the envy here is that I am miserable and everyone else is not. If I didn't hold back for my parents' sake, I would have quit long ago. I would have marched up to the boss and spoken my piece from the bottom of my heart. And so here is the honesty. He knows what he must do. But it is that thing, it is that logic of society, that he must support his parents, that he must pay off their debts, that keeps him from it. So he knows what to do, but he knows not how to do it. He would have fallen off his desk. It is funny too, the way he sits on his desk and talks down to me from the heights out to the employees, especially when they have to come right up close on account of the bosses being hard of hearing. Well, I haven't given up hope completely. Once I've gotten the money together to pay off my parents' debt to him, what will probably take another 5 or 6 years, I'm going to do it without fail. Then I'm going to go make the big break. But for the time being, I'd better get up, since my train leaves at 5. And so the action he must take now, he is pressed into the future. He must take that action now. Perhaps there is more for him in the guilt frame than there would ever be in the routines of this life. Because the guilt frame contains within it a dream, and perhaps that dream is better and more real than the real life he is living, if only he could make it so. And I think, as people in the world, we understand the lie he is telling himself, which is this, that he'll do it without fail. That once he pays off his parents' debts, he will separate himself from all he has ever known. He will break the routine. He will break the misery. I think by then he will be so married to that misery that to lose it would be a terrible, terrible crisis. Sometimes we become so married to misery that to lose it is a crisis. So that is a kind of elucidation of that paradox that we are always placing the action we should do now in the future, because we do not know how to do the action. Knowing the action and doing the action are two very different things. So I would ask you, and I think Metamorphosis asks us, what is the thing you know you must do, now? What is the thing you know you must do now? What is it that you imagine in the future? All right. Oh dear, I hate this. It gets out of focus so quickly. Let's see if we can get it back. There it is. All right. What is the thing you know you must do now? What is it that you imagine in the future? What action is it? Rather than abandoning it to that barren place, the future. Do it now. Remember that words are lies, and yet there are lies. That create worlds. Release yourself from the logic that says you cannot. And live only with the knowledge that you must now. And the world will force you into it. Because like I said, the human unhappiness, I'll take a moment to just have this on the board. Not on the board, on the on the phone. Act is what this says. Act. Do the wild thing that the world wishes you not to do. Because remember, its logic, its routine, is itself a lie. Based on history, based on facts and things that come from a past. And that past is forcing you into the future, and it's making you neglect the present. But also, to speak to that, what was I going to say? Oh yes, that his human unhappiness becomes an insect joy. I'll turn now to the page where I think that it says that. Very briefly. It's just here, right, is when it begins, the happiness begins. When Gregor's body already projected halfway out of bed, this new method was more of a game than a struggle. And so the excitement of living this new illogical life, this life as a reviled thing, the thing that has done what people wish him not to do, is a game. And it involves hopefully acquiring some purpose different than the dead routine purpose of the past. And here it brought him a smile, right? The smile of this experience of learning news, the new body he has acquired, the excitement of that newness, of being the strange thing, the excitement of being the strange thing who has become precisely what it is, or what it always has been. It is a becoming, a realizing who you are. And it's just odd that the realizing who you are comes in such a reviled package. But I think that says more about the society that reviles truth and living truthfully so much, the society that wishes us all to lie to one another rather than tell the truth, to be mendacious rather than truthful. Yes, so that is that. Is there anything else to read? Like I said, we were very much only looking at the first few. I'll end with Nabokov. He wrote a very interesting, I think it was Nabokov, or was it? I don't know. We'll see. I have his lectures on literature here. He does quite a few of them. One of my favorite books is Mad and Periphery. But he writes, of course, on the Metamorphosis. Here he's drawn the beetle, tried his best at least. This is Nabokov's copy of Metamorphosis, and you can see he's writing in it his little notes. So those of you who are wondering if it's bad to write in books, no, it's very good to write in books. It makes the books different. This book would be different than my book, and why we want that. Okay. He goes on about Jacqueline Hyde and realities. But there is something, or at some point, where he says, and I might not be able to find it because I didn't think it through. I didn't really think I was going to end with this. Well, I can't find it yet, but I'll finish on this passage by Nabokov because it is rather good. Let us look closer at the transformation. The change, though shocking and striking, is not quite so odd as might be assumed at first glance. A commonsensical commentator notes that when we go to bed in unfamiliar surroundings, we are apt to have a moment of bewilderment upon awakening, a sudden sense of unreality. And this experience must occur over and over again in the life of a commercial traveler, a manner of living that renders impossible any sense of continuity. The sense of reality depends upon continuity, upon duration. And that's an interesting that reality is merely continuity. And so reality is a narrative. But so much is dropped out of the narrative. After all, awakening as an insect is not much different from awakening as Napoleon or George Washington. I knew a man who awoke as the Emperor of Brazil. On the other hand, the isolation and the strangeness of so-called reality. This is, after all, something which constantly characterizes the artist, the genius, the discoverer. The Samsa family around the fantastic insect is nothing else than mediocrity surrounding genius. And so often the reviled thing, the resented thing, is, of course, the genius. So if you feel ostracized, if you feel as if you're always outside of something, and we all feel this, identify the reason why. And the reason that you are ostracized may be, inside of it, your genius. And it is something that you must look carefully at and utilize. Okay? Now what he said, there he is. I found what I wanted to read miraculously. Here's the beetle. This is what we'll say last. Because even as Gregor Samsa transforms into a beetle, he never forgets his human belief that he cannot fly. Curiously enough, Gregor the beetle never found out that he had wings under the hard covering of his back. This is a very nice observation on my part, to be treasured all your lives. Some Gregors, some Joes and Janes do not know that they have wings. And so I'll end on that line. Perhaps you are the Gregor, perhaps you are the Joe or the Jane who does not know that they have wings. And I encourage you today to do the thing that you know you must do and find the wings that you have always known that you have. All right, everyone. Good night, and I'll see you again soon.